We're here today talking to Johan Steyn, author of Father Michael's Lottery, a book set against the backdrop of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Africa. It was described by author Justin Cartwright as bitter, moving, bleakly funny and life-affirming, a dispatch from the front line. Johan, you work on the front line, and one of the things that you've said in other interviews that prompted you to write the book was a sense of anger.
I think initially when I started writing it, it was before antiretroviral drugs were freely available in Africa. And at that time, HIV was a death sentence. And initially, without antiretroviral drugs, it was a really frustrating exercise to try and manage AIDS patients. And I thought at the time that poses an ethical question. Is there really such a thing as two classes of patients? Patients that can afford drugs, patients that cannot afford drugs. And are doctors actually supposed to make these decisions? And that's what actually prompted me to write the book. But it actually asks an ethical question.
Yes. But what moved you to move from that point of view and that observation to actually writing?
When I first started writing the book, I was working in the UK, and I was bored, and I was longing back to Africa, and I started writing this book in longhand, just in an exercise book, Glimpses of Africa. And when I came back to Africa, I started gradually filling it out, and eventually ended up as a novel.
Just backtracking here, your career as a doctor has taken you to many places in Africa. Can you talk a little about that?
Well, I've travelled a lot in Africa. I've worked in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, but I've travelled in those countries: Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Lesotho, all over Africa.
In one of your interviews, you talked about a sort of love-hate relationship with Africa. Can you talk a bit about the love and the hate of Africa?
I think if you work in Africa, you sometimes get the feeling that it becomes just too much sometimes. But when you're away from Africa, you long back to Africa. You just cannot get Africa out of your blood. And I've made peace with that fact. I'm here and I'll stay here.
And what is it that becomes too much, do you think?
I think, well, I'm speaking from the point of view of a doctor. Especially if you're in rural medicine. You carry the can, never mind what happens. You have got to make sometimes really difficult decisions, and there's nobody really to help you with that. And sometimes it feels that you ask yourself the question, do you really want to do this? But somehow you always, even though sometimes you hate it, you always come back to it.
Which I suppose leads to the question, to what extent is the main character, the doctor in the novel, based on yourself?
I think all fiction has got some autobiographical details in it, and certainly some of Morgan's characteristics are similar to myself. And when you write a character, I mean, the character eventually develops itself in the book. So I think there are similarities, and there are also some differences between me and Morgan. But Morgan in the book is actually one part of an extreme. I try to picture the opposites of dealing with a situation. We get to one extreme, which is Holmes, which just try and save money, and Morgan tries to save everyone. And the answer is somewhere probably in between that.
One of the things that comes through in the book is the sort of, I suppose we could go back to this idea of anger, is that anger against creeping bureaucracy within medicine, which I think is something...
I think it's a big problem in medicine. That's my personal view, but I do not think that doctors should ever be confronted with a situation where he's got to play God. I mean, a patient is a patient, and the doctor's job is to treat the patient as best as he can.
Having said that it's an angry novel, one reviewer pointed out is also a compassionate, finely drawn study of ordinary people in dire situations. Somebody else said, fascinating, moving, and often very funny. How did you work the comedy into the novel? against what could be seen as a
it's
tragedy.
difficult. When I first wrote the novel, I was too angry to write it. I couldn't really get the balance. And you cannot do that, because then it just looks like a bitching session, call it that. And then I thought, just what is it really like in the bush, in the rural areas? You walk from tragedy to comedy to tragedy. You see the whole scope in one morning. And if you want to make it stick, you must try and paint that picture in the book, because it's not just doom and gloom. Africa, in a way, is a happy place, and you must bring that out. If you don't do that, if you just point out the bad things, then it won't work, and it is not real. So even in the presence of HIV, it's not just a black picture. And also suffering sometimes brings out the best in human beings, and that's also what you see as a doctor in Africa, definitely. Yeah.
Something that comes very across strongly in the novel is a sense of place, a sense of Africa, the sights and the sounds. Was that something you consciously worked on?
I very definitely worked on that. I took, I made a point of not trying to pin it to one country, but I tried to write Africa into the book, and that's all parts of Africa.
Yeah. Although you didn't sort of identify a country, there is a tendency, I think, among people to identify it as Botswana.
I think it's part of the reason, because I work there. But in constructing the novel, I made very sure that I don't describe any specific place.
Yeah. Neither do you actually identify anybody by race.
No. I make very sure of that. If you look through the book, it's a whole United Nations. There's people from every country, or many countries in Africa.